Hello, and a very warm welcome to our large and very globally spread audience to today's IISS Japan Chair Program webinar. This is the second in our program's Economic Security webinar series, in which we explore the key themes in Japan's economic security and Japan's broader geo-economic strategy. I'm Robert Ward, IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geo-economics and Strategy, also at the Institute. With my colleague Mariko Togashi, IISS Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy, we'll be facilitating today's event. The topic of today's discussion is sanctions coordination between Japan and the West against Russia. Sanctions triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February have been unprecedented, both in terms of the size of the sanctioning coalition, which includes the G7 and around 30 other countries, the measures taken, and the speed of implementation. Japan has aligned itself fully with the other members of the G7 and played a pivotal role in the economic measures taken against Russia, not least in its capacity as the only Asian member of the G7. Before I introduce our expert panel for today's session, although most of you will be familiar with the wonders of Zoom, for absolute reassurance for everybody, Mariko will explain the logistics for the event. Over to you, Mariko, please.
Thank you, Robert. Hello, my name is Mariko Togashi, Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defense Policy at the IISS. In this webinar, after the introduction of the speakers, we will begin a 35-minute discussion followed by a 20-minute Q&A session. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A function that can be found at the bottom of your screens. You're very welcome to type in your question anytime, and please state your affiliation and your name.
Thank you, Mariko. With that, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel for today. First off, we have Dr. Suzuki Kazuto. Kazuto Sensei joins us from Tokyo, where he is Director of the Institute of Geo-economics and Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo. From 2013 to 2015, Kazuto served on the panel of experts for the Iranian Sanctions Committee under the UN Security Council. Kazuto also has a distinguished record in contributing to Japanese government policy formation in areas such as space policy, export controls, and sanctions through his membership of various Cabinet Office, METI, and other subcommittees. Next off, we have Brian O'Toole. Brian joins us from North Carolina in the United States. And Brian is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Previously, Brian worked at the US Treasury as a senior advisor to the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. During this time, he played a central role in designing the US sanctions response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. Brian also helped to manage implementation of US commitments under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, with Iran. And last but very much not least, we have Dr. Maria Shigina, who is the IISS Diamond Brown Research Fellow for Economics Sanctions, Economic Sanctions Standards and Strategy. Maria joins us from our IISS Europe office in Berlin today. Before joining the Institute, Maria was a visiting senior fellow at the Center on US Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and a research fellow at the Center for Eastern European Studies at the University of Zurich. Maria covers economic statecraft, international sanctions, and energy politics, with a particular focus on the post-Soviet states. Kazuto, Brian, and Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting.
So our first question is a two-parter for Kazuto. How do you assess Japan's and the West sanctions coordination against Russia? And what differentiates the sanctions imposed this year from sanctions in the past in terms of coordination?
Well, I think there is a huge difference from the sanction coordination in 2014, when the Russians occupied Crimea, and there was a coordinated action to take sanctions against Russia. But Japan, during the Abe administration, which prioritized the negotiation for the peace treaty with Russia, so that the then Prime Minister Abe were trying to not to make any obstruction for the negotiation. So he then didn't take very serious measures for putting a pressure on Russia. And I think this time it is quite different. The Prime Minister Kishida has taken a very quick decision for abandoning the negotiation with Russia and take the full swing to take all the necessary measures against Russia and in coordination with G7. So this time it is a remarkably different from the past experience.
And remarkably different and remarkably more effective in your view, Kazuto?
Well, I think it is. Effective in a way that the coordination of the G7 will limit the access for Russia to on the items such as semiconductors or the machine tools, the various parts for aircraft and automobile. Those are the necessary items for Russia to continue producing the weapon systems and also necessary machines to continue war. So I think the cutting off the access to those supplies on Russia from Japan and from West, I think this has been making a very good effort for the Russia to find it difficult to supply the machines for the front lines.
And Maria, a sort of two-parter for you as well, if I may. Could you please also tell us how important coordination is in designing and implementing sanctions? And on sort of efficacy, in some of your writing for the Institute, you've highlighted some of the loopholes in the sanctions regime, perhaps in the financial sanctions regime around energy as well. How do these affect your assessment of the effectiveness of the sanctions?
Right, taking a broader perspective and moving to the European domain, again, coordination has been unprecedented and varies very much from what we saw in 2014, regardless whether it's Japan, EU, or the US. I'll leave the American perspective to Brian, of course. But here it's again this unprecedentedness in scope, severity, and swiftness on sanctions in all three domains, given the magnitude of sanctions, the scope of sanctions, is again impressive what has been done. And it coincides with the Biden administration's desire to revive transatlantic relationship. In March, more than 180 consultations took place. So by now, with the ongoing discussions on the price cap on oil, I believe it's much more. So it's an expensive effort in terms of time-consuming effort to bring everyone on board. And that has been quite different from 2014, simply because the level of atrocities, the gravity of situation is also very different. So that also galvanized everyone, those countries that only joined, for example, the UN sanctions regime, such as Singapore, South Korea, those in Asia in particular, quite reluctant to join any sanctions that do not come from the UN Security Council. Also on export controls, we need to highlight, again, unprecedentedness in broad sanctioning coalition. More than 37 countries joined the measures. And as Kazuto-sensei pointed out, that is important for blocking all ways through which Russia can acquire semiconductors, chips. So again, this coordination has been quite important, which will lead to our assessment for the effectiveness. For now, I would say there's two big successes here. For the factor of coordination here is freezing central bank assets. Since 2014, Russia tried to de-dollarize its foreign assets, mainly pivoting away from dollar, but to Japanese yen, to euro. And this is where the Russian government did not expect the Europeans, and also in particular the Japanese, for the reasons that Kazuto-sensei just pointed out. That was a shock for the Russian government that these two parties will join. So what was left for the Russian government is gold and Chinese yuan. So those are the currency that's currently available. And again, export controls, very broad sanction coalition. Taiwan is a key country here because Russia does not produce semiconductors domestically. That is all being sourced out to Taiwan. So Taiwan joining the measure is again the key country that will stymie the effort for Russia to replenish its equipment domestically. So we compare just briefly the two situations in 2014 and now. Apart from the gravity of situations that has helped to galvanize this support, also we knew about the Russian buildup, we knew about Russia's intention to maybe not to wage the full scale war, but at least to expand its foothold in Ukraine. So there was no element of surprise as it was in 2014. So that time to build coalition was there and it was used, I would say, productively. It doesn't mean that there are no disagreements between the allies. As we see now from extensive reporting in the Washington Post, the Europeans were still, and particularly in Berlin and in Paris, were still reluctant to join on some of the measures. Again, Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a key project here where Germany was reluctant to trigger it. Because of the fear of escalation on the Russian side. And also as a self-comparison here, the EU has become much more experienced in wielding sanctions against larger economies. Those of us who've been tracking Russia sanctions remember that in 2014, there was a lot of reluctance to trigger so-called third-tier sanctions, meaning economic and financial sanctions. Today, we're talking that sanctions were put in place are vastly different in terms of their impact on Russia. So the EU has become accustomed to the idea to use heavier weapons against those bigger countries, and that will have also implications for our discussion on China. And also just last reference here to the internal EU debate. In 2014, there was a lot of internal discussion between EU member states. There was a pushing and pulling behavior between countries that were lobbying for more sanctions and those who were lobbying for lifting sanctions. This time, it's actually quieter behind the scenes. Some countries are still using some concessions, like Hungary recently said that they would not prolong sanctions unless the EU lifts sanctions on oligarchs. But overall, we should say that there is a stronger consensus to impose sanctions than there was in 2014.
I just see we've got some questions coming in. Thank you, Miro. We've got some questions coming in already, so please do keep them coming in. Over to you, Mariko.
Thank you, Robert. So Brian, Suzuki-sensei and Maria just discussed this unprecedented level and scale of coordination and its importance. So I'd like to break down a little more on the coordination. So what factors do you think enable this unprecedented level of coordination this time, perhaps in comparison to the past sanctions, such as the ones against Iran? What are the similarities and differences? And also, could you identify some of the obstacles in coordinating sanctions from US perspective, including implementation and enforcement?
Sure. Yeah, I think Maria covered a lot of this pretty well. When it comes to sanctions coordination, the Biden administration has tried to rebuild some of the bridges that the Trump administration burnt in Europe. And those early kind of overtures to Europe at the beginning of the administration were certainly a big factor in helping smooth this path along. This would have been a lot more difficult had it been kind of right at the beginning of the Biden administration, with Europeans still kind of upset and skeptical at Washington, D.C. I think, though, that the compelling factor here is less about any of the kind of bickering across the pond and differences in administration, and more to do with the threat that was posed by Russia. The 2014 sanctions were following essentially a largely opportunistic land grab by Russia on Crimea after the fall of Yanukovych, and the kind of nascent insurgency / whatever you want to call it in the Donbass. I mean, it was a Russian-funded and directed insurgency, but that was more of a kind of game of chance that came up as an opportunistic thing for Vladimir Putin to take advantage of. It has been clear for some time, Putin published a rather insane diatribe last year about Ukraine's lack of statehood and the fact that, this is historically Russia. And, there has been this building kind of process to get to this point. And this was a much more considered and planned exercise out of the Kremlin, even if it was a small group of people planning it, which is part of the challenge for the Russians and for the US in convincing the allies around the world that Russia was really for real going to invade this time, despite the clarity of the intelligence. So I think the threat, though, to bear in mind here is it's not, Maria characterized it as taking Ukraine or something short of that to expand the foothold. I actually think it's quite a bit broader than that. I think the threat here was Putin's plan to fundamentally fracture NATO and the Western world order. And that's not just Ukraine. There was talk kind of in the run-up to the conflict and certainly early in the conflict about restoring historic Russian borders. So even pre Tsarist Russia, basically, which goes a lot broader than just the USSR even. So it's I think that's the threat really here is it was Ukraine, but also Poland and the Baltics. And what happens if you get in a real shooting war with Russia, vis-a-vis NATO? And I think those are the threats that really galvanized this. And I think U.S. intelligence did an excellent job of exposing Russia. I think this all would have been very different had the declassifications in Washington not come out in November, which were crucial to getting Europe on board to the policy for sanctions eventually, but also I think had a delaying effect on the Russian military action. I think it caught the Russians by surprise. So I think those are really the big factors. And then it comes down to, the basic legwork of being in foreign policy in a government, right? You've got to talk to colleagues all the time. You've got to set up video calls. You've got to travel. State Department and Treasury Department officials and DoD officials have been traveling across to Europe with great frequency. Same thing around Asia. And there's, what happens a lot of times is there's the discussion around joining a sanctions coalition. And even if a country isn't willing to go as far as, say, the United States or the UK or Brussels, the idea basically, kind of taking from Switzerland's example, although Switzerland has actually joined in measures this time, which is remarkable, that even if they don't join in sanctions, they're not going to be a waypoint for sanctions evasion. And that has historically been where some of the Asian allies and partners have been for the West. I'll say one last factor that was a bit of a complication in running up to this, and Maria talked about how the coordination and support for sanctions has been better. I think there were concerns on the US side in the run up to this that London not being formally part of the EU would have an impact, because the Brits had for a long time played a significant role, especially behind the scenes, in kind of pushing ideas, funding research. The British government is very capable on all of these, and that kind of capacity just isn't there anymore for the EU. They don't have the research capabilities. They don't have the intelligence capabilities of the British government. And that was a little bit of a concern. I think, what Maria talked about with kind of ongoing support for the sanctions is all the more remarkable because leaders in 2014 of the European Union were uniformly more kind of Westernized than they are today. Viktor Orban was not Viktor Orban, right? And so there are a handful of leaders in Europe these days who are a little farther towards Putin's side of the transom, but there is still this great coordination and unanimity, which I think is kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Can I just leap in there a second, because Brian, you made a comment about NATO and Putin, and you sort of mentioned Maria, but I'd like to draw Kazuto in as well. Maria, Kazuto, would you like to give your thoughts on what Brian just said? Interesting comment there.
Maria, you go ahead.
Yeah, sure. On NATO, that thing depends on your interpretation of Russia's objectives here, but that could be interpreted in many ways. So I think we're talking about coordination focused on Ukraine, on Russia. That is what I meant originally. But I think I'd like to add a couple of points to my original answer. I think with all unprecedentedness, as we mentioned here, for me, another area that has emerged here is the role of international organizations. So we mentioned G7, that was key in terms of forging these coalitions on sanctions and export controls as well. And G7 has become this brain power behind not just checking notes, but also testing new ideas, which type of sanctions can be put in place. And sure, we'll come down to the price cap at some point here, but also SWIFT sanctions were tested there, whether all allies were on the same page. The US-EU TTC, Trade and Technology Council, surprisingly came out in this light of Russian invasion. Originally wasn't designed to counter anything coming from Russia, but the second meeting was really shaped by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and they highlighted the role of this council in forging the coalition on export controls. And last but not least, the other development here is the establishment of task forces when it comes to seizing assets. So this transatlantic coordination goes, again, quite astonishing in many ways. It doesn't always become positive. So one example here from Germany is that Germany is using now the pretext of lack of coordination to weapons, for example, that it doesn't want to send weapons by itself. So sometimes, as you know, the condition on coordination can be used in various ways here. So it's not always positive. And something that Brian pointed out was the UK role. There is also an emerging trend that countries are using sanctions on the national level. So UK has aligned itself largely and has become this main ally of the US when it comes to pushing for sanctions, sometimes for not waiting for others to join, just to test how much the others would follow its example. But there is this other trend that, for example, Baltic countries come with their own national measures when it comes to visa bans, and they just want to securitize their neighborhood as much as they can. So coordination doesn't always happen here, but there are other trends that also emerging with this type of measures here.
And Kazuto, would you like to add a comment to that?
Yeah, in terms of the coordination, what is interesting from a Japanese perspective is that there are a number of the occasions that Japan's minister responsible for sanctions, which is the Mr. Nishimura currently, and Mr. Hagiuda before, who is the minister for METI, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And there are frequent meetings with the counterparts of the United States Commerce Secretary Ronald and also USTR Ms. Tai. However, the major discussion were not really about the sanctions against Russia, but it is more about the building of resilience or strengthening and resilient supply chain between Japan and the United States. And also there were the coordination of the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which includes the countries in the Southeast Asia for building up the more resilient supply chain. So I think we are no longer, I think unlike the transatlantic coordination, the trans-Pacific coordination is more of the bilateral coordination between Japan and United States, and the Japanese policy is much more focused on the further or coming to the future, focusing on the future possible economic statecraft by China, or the possible confusion of the supply chain through the Taiwan Straits. And these are more important element for the policy coordination between Japan and the United States and other other like-minded Southeast Asian countries, including South Korea. So I think this is kind of different tones that we are working in terms of the coordination. Technically, Japan is, Japan doesn't have the legal means and measures to initiate the sanctions. So we are more or less a follower of what has been proposed in NATO and in G7. And I think that, as Maria mentioned, that there are a lot of experimental projects throughout the G7, G7 framework for sanctions against Russia. And I think Japan is now trying to catching up with the these new measures, which hasn't been implemented in Japan, and that has been a major challenge for the Japan to coordinate. So in terms of the coordination, Japan is more focusing on the future of the what may happen in the East Asian regions, and also we are taking challenges for the implementation of the sanctions.
Thank you, Kazuto-sensei. You just mentioned about the alliance and also the limitation that Japan has currently, but do you see, like I was asking to Brian before, do you see those are the main obstacles for Japan in terms of coordination?
Yeah, well, yes, the legal framework or lack of legal means is one big major obstacle. But the other major issue that Japan alone is facing is the dependence on the oil and gas from Sakhalin. And Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI, has been very conscious about the Russia using the Sakhalin-2, which is the gas field project to and mainly exporting the gas to Japan, and Russia is using this as the leverage to move the Japanese position within the G7. So we are fully aware that the Russia is trying to use the Sakhalin-2 as a leverage, and Russia regard Japan as the weakest link in the G7. So we are sticking to the current, the sanctions coordination with G7, but at the same time, METI is trying to maintain the Japan's ownership and Japan's interest in the Sakhalin-2. So we are trying to make a balance, but at the end of the day, I think we are ready to face that. If there is a possibility that the Russia is nationalized and seize the assets in the Sakhalin-2, Japanese assets in the Sakhalin-2, then it may, we are taking a risk that that may happen. But nevertheless, we are trying to pursue the both sides of the story to maintain the Sakhalin-2 while maintaining the coordination with G7.
Thank you, Kazuto-sensei. So Brian, from the U.S. perspective, like in the previous question, you mentioned that threat being a primary driver, and also there's certain limitations that UK not being part of the EU anymore. But from U.S. perspective, do you think that those are the primary obstacles? Not to just focus on obstacles to be negative, but to have an implication to future coordination?
I think the discussion around obstacles often gets focused a little too myopically on, whether it's Japan's, reliance on Sakhalin, or, the UK being out of the EU, or, Viktor Orban trying to torpedo sanctions on oligarchs for whatever reason. I think when you look at this from a big government perspective, right, and I've sat in these meetings, I've traveled around the world for these types of discussions, the focus is on getting everybody moving in the same direction at the same time, right? Broadly speaking, US unilateral sanctions can have the majority of the impact of a global coalition because the US is such a dominant financial center. The semiconductors and other kind of export restrictions the US has put in could largely be accomplished just via unilateral US means, because the way that the US sanctions regime works is so impactful that in some ways, you get, call it 70-80% of the impact going alone. But as the Trump administration saw, that doesn't necessarily produce results, right? The Trump administration imposed kind of huge impact on Iran when they pulled out of the JCPOA and reimposed U.S. sanctions unilaterally, without the imprimatur of the United Nations, which the Bush administration had started and the Obama administration continued. So they hurt the Iranian economy quite a lot, but they didn't get any results. In fact, they got worse results, arguably, given how much Iran kind of, the backlash from Iran reverberated from the administration's actions. So the point in a lot of ways, if you're sitting in DC as a policymaker, or even in Brussels or London, is to make sure that there is unity of kind of purpose. And that is honestly, I think, in many ways more important than unity in measures, right? So if the US takes, a set of actions that is, this big, and Japan takes it this big, and Switzerland takes it this big, the fact that the Swiss participate at all, or the Japanese participate at all, is a really big deal. And it's a signal that, even if the measures are not exactly the same, there will be substantial impact felt in Moscow. And that Moscow is not going to get relief from this simply by trying to hive off different or split off different allies. They're going to have to address the underlying cause of the sanctions, which is their illegal war in Ukraine. So I think that's the most important thing, really, is to, these things come up and countries have different interests, and the US has interests too, right? So you've got to manage through those constraints and try to figure out how you craft kind of an optimal policy. And that's going to involve a lot of twists and turns and various gyrations to get there. But at the end of the day, if you've got everybody moving in the same direction at once, that's, I think, the ultimate policy goal.
I thought I liked your way of describing this, Brian. Unity of purpose more important than unity of measures. I thought that was. I shall go away and think about that. That was useful.
That's less pedantic than going with the Monty Python quote. Wondering, not get bogged down in who killed who.
Always room for Monty Python quotes on our webinars. So I had a question though. What related to, I think related to what you've just said, actually. What are the implications of what we've seen with regard to Russia for future sanctions coordination, that particularly against large or very, very large countries as we've seen, like Russia, which I think is the largest country to have been sanctioned since the end of the Second World War, retaliate? So clearly we're learning lessons here as well, I would have thought. What do you make of all this?
I think the biggest lesson of this round of sanctions on Russia, as kind of the Western world thinks about how, it's China, right, that everybody talks about. I think the biggest lesson there is kind of twofold. It actually comes partially from COVID, and it's all about shoring up the supply chains. And I think finding a way to make your supply chains resilient to geopolitical disruptions or health disruptions. This has been called friend shoring, not onshoring, but friend shoring. Having like-minded countries as part of your supply chain may be more resilient in the long run. And so I think that's really where the policy is going to go. And I think that's where governments are going to focus, because what it does is it lets them get out ahead. There's clearly kind of brewing difficulty with China. They have, they may have their own issues internally and economic growth challenges at the moment. But regardless of what happens with Taiwan, right, we've had the Chinese energy grab, the Chinese straits, the disputes over territory in China's, exclusive economic zone. Those are issues that have been around for a long time and are not going to go away, regardless of whether or not they decide to invade Taiwan. And so making the West and Western, throw Japan under the broader Western kind of umbrella, just because the economies are kind of, political structures are built essentially the same way, or at least mostly. I think that's going to be the big focus, is how does the West collectively minimize the impact of one of these events in the future? And whether that's multipolarity and how you look at structured world order, or or friendshoring or whatever you want to call it. I think the idea that, unfortunately, Germany, I think, held on to for too long with Russia, well, if we trade with Moscow, inevitably there are going to be enough linkages there to prevent war in Europe. I think that broad concept has been shattered, and I think that's the adjustment that needs to be made.
Thank you. And Brian, Kazuto,
I think you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
yeah, Kazuto.
Right. Thank you. I perfectly understand, and I concur with what Brian said. But also, I like to add that if we just try to, bring everything back to our, our friendshoring and try to decouple China, I think that's a wrong strategy, because I think what we can learn from the sanctions on Russia is that Russia has depended on the supply chain from the West. I mean, the semiconductor is a good example. So I think make them vulnerable to and dependent on the particular, strategic items such as semiconductors or the strategic materials or, any types of the items that is clearly linked to their economic and also the military activities. So I think the making it dependent, or let me in the rephrase in Japan that we are talking about the indispensability. So if we became indispensable to either China or Russia, then we can hold the choke points. And I think this is the sort of the weapon that we can use in the future. And I think creating those better weapons, much effective weapons, are another way of approaching this to have a more effective sanctions. And I think we can prove that from the lessons that we learned from Russia, that Russia is suffering from to the access to certain particular strategic items. So yes, try to make all the vulnerable things. So let's reduce the vulnerability by friendshoring, onshoring, and try to reduce our the potential leverage in China and Russia. But at the same time, we create and added more indispensability in the relationship with China.
Kazuto, just to follow up on that, you said decoupling from China is a mistake. I think my memory is right. But do you think decoupling from China is actually possible, given how embedded China is in the global economy fully?
Well, technically, I think it's impossible. I mean, if we have the complete shutdown of the trade and the economic relationship with China, if you mean decoupling as a complete shutdown, I think it's impossible. But we can do, some sort of a distinct, partial decoupling of this particular items, which are currently we depend on China in terms of the for example, the large-scale batteries, or some of the medical products, or So what Japan is currently trying to do by economic security promotion law is to identify the strategic important items to be less dependent, or to remove the over dependence on China, and try to make it sort of a partial decoupling. And I think this is what we can learn from some of the Baltic states that is trying to reduce the gas supply from Russia and try to reduce the 100% dependence to the 0%, such as in case of Lithuania. So these are the possible if we focus on the certain items to decouple from China, but I'm not saying that it can be done in the entire economy.
Thank you, Kazuto. I'm going to move now to questions. We've got some good questions piling up in the Q&A box, and I've got one question which is quite a big question from Francisco Castelo Branco, who is from, I think, Olja Direto, I think, Francisco, if I got that right. And Francisco's question is, can Western sanctions bring down the Putin regime? Big question. Maria, I think you were looking intensely at me there, that one. So I'll give you the first stab at that.
Yeah, I think this is the type of question you get a lot, whether sanctions can, bring the Putin regime to collapse, they can bring the Russian economy to the ground. And this is where the assessment of the effectiveness of sanctions starts. It starts with the objective, right? The objective was to erode Russia's ability to fund the war. And that was meant to be done either via financial means, by constraining the revenues that Russia gets, mainly via energy. This is something that is still work in progress, obviously, but also by adding these export control measures that would make it harder for Russia to replenish the lost equipment. So the idea is not necessarily very different from 2014 sanctions. Actually, it's not a behavioral change. It's not the collapse of the Putin's regime. It's by constraining Russia's abilities here and also make it harder to do the same aggression or to renew it in the short term. So this is, we need to say that at the moment, the absence of energy sanctions, so we have announced them, but we haven't implemented from the European side. I mean, the US, the UK have implemented the energy sanctions in March, but this is the key now flaw in the current sanctions regime, that we have a paradoxical situation where we still purchase Russian oil, but we try to erode Russia's ability to fund the war and basically send quite a lot of money to the regime.
Thank you, Maria. Brian, did you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, the short answer is no. And this is true of all sanctions and all regimes, basically. Sanctions are an extraordinarily poor choice for regime change. The current deputy director of CIA and former undersecretary of Treasury has written about this, David Cohen, and not surprisingly, I've worked closely with David over the years, and I hold the same views. If you think about it right on a theoretical level, sanctions are used for a few purposes. You can identify bad actors like terrorists. You can isolate, which I think is really the large point of isolate and constrain, which is the large point of the sanctions against Russia. And then you can change behavior, right? The idea being that if you impose sanctions, you can use that as leverage to entice some behavior trait. A regime is never going to choose to remove itself from power in exchange from sanctions relief. So that makes that one entirely out. The identification of bad actors, it's not, that's better used for things like narcotics trafficking and terrorism, where the people doing the bad behavior are kind of far under the radar for most people. And so you're left with essentially constraining and isolating. And autocratic regimes, which are typically where you're going to see sanctions imposed, can survive, by basically repressing people and denying them, resources and wealth. And so they can hang on in a situation of isolation and constraint. People talk a lot about the Putin regime hanging on these days, and the fact that, sanctions on North Korea and Iran haven't worked to change the regime, or Cuba for that matter. But the point of those sanctions is not necessarily to change those regimes. I think the irony that people miss when they point out that, Iran or North Korea are still standing in terms of their regimes, and so Putin can too, if they're advocating for sanctions to be a regime change tool, is that, the idea that Russia is going to turn into North Korea is probably not really on Putin's radar. That's not really what he wants, even if he's trying to import North Korean weapons these days. So it's a poor tool for regime change, should never be thought of in that world, in my view.
Kazuto, you're nodding there in Tokyo.
Well, from my experience in the sanctions, panel of sanctions on Iran, I think the reason why the Iran reached to the JCPOA was because the sanctions has translated. The sanctions created the economic damage in Iran, and then this damage has translated into the people's dissatisfactions and discontent, And then there was something called the election. And then there was a new president came in, from Ahmadinejad to Rouhani. And the Rouhani's, pledge was to, negotiate with West and to lift the sanctions. So if there is a mechanism to translate from the economic damage to the political change, then you might expect that the Putin regime may change, or I don't think that even so that, they are not, taking down, but I think, we can't really change the behavior of Putin because this translation is obstructed by this oppression, as Brian mentioned, and therefore I think the sanctions are not meant to be the regime change or behavioral change or policy change. I think I agree with Maria that this is the aim of the sanctions is to raise the cost of continuing war and trying to prevent the finance and the supply of for the war machines in Russia.
Got another question looking to the future, actually, from Umar Ahmed Badami from Georgetown University. Once the Ukraine war ends, are there plans for sanctions to continue to be in place and enforced? Brian, perhaps that's one for you first.
Yes. I think while there is some, and I would suggest that the overarching goal of these sanctions involves financing the war and those kinds of objectives, but that's really not the central tool. Sanctions aren't really a great war fighting tool either. What happens in the war will be the result of military support for Ukraine and financing Ukraine is more than anything the West is going to do with sanctions. Positive externalities for sure, but not the explicit goal. Sanctions are there because Putin has been participating in external aggression for too long. He's not going to change, right? Even if Ukraine takes back all of the territory that it has lost since 2014 and gets back Crimea and the Donbass, after this rather impressive military maneuver that they've conducted for the last week, it is not as if the threat from Vladimir Putin is going to go away, right? Even if there's a stalemate at Ukraine's border, the threat of another invasion or more undermining of democracy from Russia will remain, and therefore sanctions will remain. Sanctions, I think, will remain for as long as Putinism is the dominant form of power in Russia.
Maria.
I think from the European perspective, the answer is not so maybe 100% yes, because obviously, as you know, Berlin, France have their own deals and compromises in head, and again this was extensively reported how much this disagreement on what constitutes an escalation, what we have to do with Russia, really jeopardizes coordination and sometimes speed of sanctions. So I can't exclude that once, let's say, the best scenario for Ukraine, it wins all of the territory back before February 23, or maybe even Donbass, given the last counteroffensive. I can foresee voices within the European capitals advocating for lifting at least some of the sanctions. So that is definitely can jeopardize the coordination that we have been addressing today. And that is something to address. And I think that points to again, another weak spot in the current sanctions regime, that there is no agreement on the end game of it. And it's very different if you look from the US or the European capitals. There is this vague definition of strategic failure of Russia, but even from the American perspective, it's not military defeat of Russia, right? And in Europe, that can be read very differently. So that disagreement of what we want from Russia and what type of Russia, not necessarily the regime change I'm talking here about, but how to deal with Russia in the future, I think can be a danger where certain sanctions can be lifted or at least be lobbied to be lifted.
Thank you, Maria. And Kazuto.
Right. My answer is yes, but I agree with Maria that there are certain differences of the objective of the meaning of sanctions and objective of the sanctions. And I think the sanctions would have the certain effect of the punishment of those who started the war and committed to the war. And also there is a function of prevention of the future war. So perhaps the sanctions may be imposed to continue to impose for preventing the Russian to access to much higher performing semiconductors, or other various emerging technologies such as AI and the drones, etc. So I think these sanctions may remain. Some of the sanctions, perhaps the financial sanctions, may lift it for humanitarian purposes or otherwise, but I think overall the sanctions regime will be maintained, probably not as much coordinated as the current situation with G7, but I think in terms of the prevention of the future war, I think this would make the sanctions will be the leverage for the further Russian behavior. So probably it is wise to keep sanctions to make sure that we can use this as a leverage for the further change of the behavior of Russia.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions here because I'm conscious we've only got about 9.5 minutes left. So I want to finish on time if we can. I'm just going to point a couple of these questions in direction of certain panelists, and brevity, please, if you can. One, I think this picks up on something that you said, Maria, about EU. I think you described EU sanctions as unprecedented. And the question here is, does that mean that new sanctions against Russia are a paradigm shift in EU sanctions policy? So a shift in the principles underpinning sanctions and in the EU's approach to the use of such a tool?
The brevity, yes and no, I guess. So what I meant was unprecedented, it's self-referential, right? If we compare it with 2014, it's much quicker, much larger, and there is more appetite for sanctions. Again, the EU was not ready in 2014 to freeze Russian central bank assets. So that's a qualitative shift in thinking. But something that Brian addressed, Kazuto-sensei as well, there is a larger appetite for strengthening your domestic resilience. So not necessarily sanctions policy, we still don't have, for example, reforms to introduce qualitative majority voting to get rid of this unanimity that really slows down the EU decision-making at sanctions. The EU can't necessarily be as agile as geopolitics requires. So there are two trends here that are happening within the EU. Because of the inability to introduce this qualitative majority voting, the idea is to go down the path of better coordination and information sharing. And quite a lot of reforms have been put in place actually before the invasion. It comes down to that open strategic autonomy concept. There is a lot of institutions that might be potentially created to enhance this coordination. Again, on export control, something a weak spot within the EU, because there is a phenomenon of window shopping that everyone can choose whatever countries to apply for a license, and then you're free to go with this product. But also there is a stronger discussion on domestic resilience. And that happens in the energy sector. Again, the key sector for Russia, because it's traditional Russian export market. And probably if it wasn't for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we wouldn't have seen such an accelerated effort to coordinate so many energy measures in terms of supply diversification, refilling gas storages. So that's, in that sense, it's also quite unprecedented.
And Brian, would you like to come in on that particular question?
I think Maria covered it very well. I think there's aspects of it that are unprecedented, the scope and speed, but I think at the end of the day, right, the basic fundamentals of this are all the same. It's just, she said, described very well. I think this has forced a lot of decisions that were otherwise moving too slowly on other policies and related policies. So I think it's, it's good to see the EU move this quickly. It's also good to see other discussions being forced about how to be more effective, because it is a problem for the union writ large.
Thank you, Brian. And one for you, Kazuto, about the Mitsui and Mitsubishi's Sakhalin-2 project. The question is all that's going on here a sign of sanctions miscoordination? And how could this, what's going on with the project, affect Japan's stance towards Russia in future?
That's a very good question. And I think I wouldn't say this is a miscoordination. I think this is the risk that Japan took, and Russia tried to exploit it. And I think this is the consequence of there's something that we have to, we have to deal with when we try to, the Russia is not sitting there and receiving, being sanctioned. The Russia will take the sort of a retaliatory measures, and this is one of which. Also, the Russia has sanctioned me. I mean, I'm on the sanctions list. So, I'm shockingly surprised. But I don't have any particular personal, grievances because I don't have any assets in Russia, nor I have no plans to enter in Russia. But these are the sort of measures that you might expect that when you place sanctions, then there'll be a retaliation. And I think the Japan is a more exposed partners, and also it is part of the it is similar to the Russia stopping the gas supply through the Nord Stream 1. So but the stakes is high, and Japan has invested in the Sakhalin 2 project for a long time. So there is sort of a very sentimental attachment, as well as the the national energy strategy. So this has been the a lot, this invoked a lot of discussion within Japan, but I wouldn't say this is a result of the miscoordination. And I think Japan, again, as I said, Japan is trying to maintain the very strong position against Russia and prioritize the coordination with G7. But meanwhile, we try to maintain the ownership and the investment in Sakhalin 2 for the sake of the energy security, and looking at the future beyond the post-Putin period. Sakhalin 2 will remain there even after the the Putin lose power, or post when the war is over. So I think we are not making this sort of short-term decision, and I think this is the position of Japan.
Thank you. Mariko, you had a question.
Thank you. If I may ask the last question. So we covered a lot of topics today, mainly focusing on coordination, but what do the sanctions today mean for the world? The scope of the sanctions are expanding, and imposing sanctions and retaliation reaction to it are changing the global economic landscape and exposure, supply chains, payment system, and perhaps a bigger picture of the world too. And I know this is a very big question, but I'd like to ask to all the speakers. Maybe we can start with Brian.
Sure. I think the fundamental message of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia for the rest of the world is that you cannot get away from the Western economies. Full stop, right? Russia went into this conflict thinking, and this, was a dominant kind of line in the Kremlin and among the Siloviki in Russia, that they could just invade Ukraine and continue to sell oil and gas and everything, export their grain, and it would be just like the Soviet days. And instead, as one of the other questions is implying, they're stripping microwaves for semiconductors to try to launch for missile parts, right? Like, I'm not too worried about your microwave-powered anti-aircraft missile coming out of Russia. And what it shows and demonstrates is that, especially when the West is united, there is no escaping the kind of hammer blow that being cut off from the global financial system causes. You can operate as an autarky, but it's a terrible place to be. And I think the speed, the power, and the impact has got to be jarring for those who would otherwise seek to undermine those structures.
Maria?
I think in the short term, I concur with Brian's picture, what it means for the world in general, how quickly we can unplug larger economies, right? Especially if it comes from the US. But I think long-term implications are rather more blurry, how much it will sustain like this. in terms of not necessarily how broad it will be, but it will definitely incentivize countries like China, like Russia, to establish their own alternatives in supply chains, and everyone will be looking for friends. Obviously, Russia is short on friends, but it will still try to find even those among sanctions countries like Iran, Venezuela, and so on, even if China doesn't always come to the rescue. So that sort of securitization of supply chain we'll already see in the parallel imports, the restructuring. Sometimes it's obviously bordering with illicit and sanctions busting, but obviously it will eventually be restructuring of goods for lower quality, not necessarily the best, but this will be the isolated Russia in the long term. But also similar, so Russia and China will also double down on creating and expanding their financial instruments. It doesn't necessarily mean they will be successful. For example, Russia's SWIFT equivalent, even Iran and Venezuela still didn't join, but they will try to push for it as much as they can in that sense. And also for China, I think what it means, so obviously we are drawing our own lessons, but China is doing its own home task at how to be more securitized and protected from potential sanctions of Russia's scope here. And they have done quite a lot of measures. It doesn't mean they have perfect plan how to be isolated at the moment. This interdependence really cuts both ways, but they're trying to reduce their exposure in the financial sphere in particular, perhaps restructuring some of the supply chains when it comes to semiconductors as well. So for us, for the West, it means how to be credible with our deterrence when it comes to China in the long term.
Thank you. And Kazda-sensei, if we can let us hear your thoughts too.
Right. Well, thank you very much for this. I think I'm taking the last opportunity to talk. I think this is a great question, and I think it is extremely important that we raise awareness of the potential change of the world, that we thought that the world is flat, and we can invest anywhere we want. We can import energy from anywhere we want, and that's a sort of a very optimistic view of the world. And I think the world is much more full of danger. And there are potential cases that countries with ambition of invading other countries and having the insecurity and anxiety and whatever reason there is an action beyond the economic rationality. And I think this is the importance. And we have been, involved in this globalized economy based on the economic rationality, and there was an assumption that everyone will take the rational behavior, and I think this is no longer the case. The Russia proved it. So I think what is going to happen from now on is to maintain the sort of the international interdependence, the global supply chain, but within that we would be we raise awareness of the possible risks that the country takes certain measures that is going beyond the economic rationality, and we have to be prepared for such cases, and we have to build up our stockpiles on the natural gases, or we have to build up our own own supply chain capabilities within our friends. There are not the sort of a dynamic tectonic shift of the economic systems, but I think it's the shift in the mentality of that we are no longer living in the sort of a fancy world of that you can get the benefit, you can invest wherever you want and make the maximum profit.
Thank you, Kazuto. A nice way to end. I think you said the world is not flat. That's a nice assertion to end this webinar with, so thank you for that. Thank you, Kazuto, Brian, and Maria, for this fantastic and engaging conversation on sanctions coordination between Japan and other issues as well. I certainly found this discussion rich and informative, and I hope our audience did as well. Those of you that stayed up late to listen to this and or got up early to listen to it as well. A recording of the webinar will be made available on the IISS website. That's at www.iiss.org within the next 24 hours. You can also find our first economic security webinar, at which we hosted Japan's first economic security minister, Kobayashi Takayuki, also on our website, if you're interested. We hope you'll be able to join us for future IISS Japan Chair webinars. Thank you again to our guests, and thank you to all of our audience. Goodbye.